On today's video, I'll build a desk using only the wood from this thrift store coffee table. I almost walked right past this coffee table at the thrift store, but then I noticed that it was made entirely of solid walnut. There's no plywood or veneer used on it. So while I wasn't into the style of the coffee table, I thought it would be a fun project to try to build something else using the walnut from the coffee table. I began by disassembling the table, and I started with these screws on the bottom. They were going through the bottom shelf into the legs. But the legs were also glued to the panel, so I got out a rubber mallet and gave it a few whacks. And it eventually came off, but it did end up splitting in two. But it was a pretty clean break, so I just glued it back together. Once the glue was dry on the bottom panel, I could remove the clamps and then I had to clean up any of the dried glue squeeze out. There were also screws going through the top shelf into the top of the legs, but they were covered up with a wood plug. So I first had to drill out the plugs. And then I could get a screwdriver in there and take the screws out. Since the legs were glued on as well as being screwed on, when I took them off, they pulled up a little bit of the walnut from the board. And I wanted to save that because I was going to need as much usable wood as I could get out of this. So I just heated it up with a heat gun to soften the glue and worked a tool underneath. And they came off pretty easily. And then I could just glue them back onto the board. Then it was time to remove the finish, and to do this, I started by scraping it off. And that took care of most of it. And whatever was left, I took off with a sander. And yes, I could have just sanded off all of the finish instead of scraping, but I find that scraping is quicker than trying to sand it off. The bottom shelf was the board that I was going to use to make the legs for the desk. It was too thin to make legs out of it as it was, so my plan was to first cut the board to the correct length for the legs, and take that long board and then cut it in two lengthwise. And glue those two pieces together. I let the glue dry overnight. And once I got the clamps off, I took it inside to the table saw and cut out 4 legs. I had this small piece of wood that was cut off the board when I made the legs, and I decided to use this to make the aprons and the stretchers for the sides. It was just enough to get 2 aprons and 2 stretchers, one for each side, but the grain would have to run vertically instead of horizontally. The stretchers were pretty narrow, and I wasn't sure how well they were going to work because of the orientation of the grain. So I decided to inlay a strip of walnut down the middle, and I could just use some scraps from when I cut up the legs. And to do this, I just cut a slot down the middle with the table saw and then glued in the strips of walnut. And once the glue was dry, I trimmed the inlays flush with a plane. Unfortunately, it didn't work out so well, and the pieces were actually warped after the inlays were glued in. As you can see here, when I held them side by side, there was a pretty large gap in between them because of how twisted they were. But I did like the look of the inlay, so I wanted to make an attempt to try and save them. And to do this, I took a damp t-shirt and put it over the stretchers, and I took a hot steam iron and went over them for a while, tried to get them nice and warm and wet. And then I took a scrap piece of granite countertop that I had that's pretty flat, and I clamped them to that flat surface while they were still warm and wet, hoping that they would straighten out a bit. I left them like that overnight, and the next day when I took the clamps off, they were still warped. And they may have actually been warped even worse. So that didn't work, and it was on to plan B. Plan B was to use these two pieces of trim as the stretchers. And this actually should have been plan A, but I forgot that I had them. So these pieces have the grain running horizontally and should work a lot better. And I also had these longer pieces of trim, and one of them was a little too bowed to use for anything, but the other one was pretty straight, and I decided to use this as an apron just for the back of the desk, and the front of the desk wouldn't have one. To clean them up, I just took them to the table saw and ran them through a few times, and I took off most of the decorative curvy parts, but I tried to save as much wood as I could because they were pretty thin to begin with. The table saw took off most of the finish that was on there, except for on this curved part. So for this, I just scraped it off. To join all the pieces together, I used dowels. On the larger pieces, I was able to use this dowel jig to get the placement for the holes and also to drill them. And it helped to keep the drill straight as I was drilling the holes. But on the smaller pieces, like the stretchers, I wasn't able to use it. So I just had to drill it freehand and just try my best to stay straight. Then I was ready to glue the leg assemblies together, and I used some tape around the joints to try to keep any glue squeeze out from getting onto the wood. Then it was time to prepare the top, and the piece that I'm using for the top was also the top for the coffee table. But I actually flipped it over so that the bottom side became the top. And it didn't look like it had any finish on it, but I needed to clean it up anyway. So I did do some sanding, and it had a few of these holes. They look like maybe they're knots. And to fill those in, I just took some of the walnut sanding dust and put it into the hole. And mixed in a little super glue. And then some more dust and a little more super glue until it filled the hole. And this worked really well, but if you're planning on staining the piece, this might not be the best way to go because that super glue won't absorb stain. But in this case, I wasn't using stain. I was just going to put on a clear finish, so it worked well. It also had 4 holes where the screws went for the legs, so I needed to fill those. And to do that, I made some walnut plugs with a plug cutter and a scrap piece from the coffee table. And then I could glue in the plug. And when the glue dried, I just cut it flush with a chisel. Then it was time to apply the finish, and I used a clear finish from Waterlocks. I didn't need to do any staining on this piece because the walnut just had such great color all on its own. I put the finish on before I glued the 2 leg assemblies to the long stretcher that went along the back of the desk. It just seemed like it would be easier to apply the finish if they were not glued together yet. So once the finish had dried, I needed to glue that stretcher in. And again, I used some tape around the joints to try to keep any glue squeeze out off of the new finish. Once that glue was dried, then I could attach the top. And to do this, I used L brackets. I used brackets that had holes that were slightly bigger than the screws so that there was some room for the top to move. And by the way, this top was not perfectly flat, but I used it anyway because if I had tried to plane it flat, it would have removed too much wood, and it was already kind of thin to begin with. So I just used it as it was, and it was flat enough that it would work fine for me as a desk. And here it is, all finished. Thanks for watching.